Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik from Figured Out Productions. The following video is a video of some kind, and I hope you enjoy it.
Hey guys, it's Adam here. Please excuse the crudity of this particular video as I am shooting in my office. We are addressing a little bit of some news, but mostly rumors. Now, you guys know me. I don't typically do news or rumors videos unless they really kind of catch my interest for one reason or another. And this would actually be a special exception case. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about some Xbox stuff, specifically possible backwards compatibility updates and perhaps the future of the brand. If you guys could do me a favor though before we get into this, if you could like this video, comment down below, subscribe if you've never done that before, as well as check out all my social media stuff in the description. I've got Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, Patreon, Spreadshirt, Travel Channel, all that stuff. I appreciate it. It's down there. There's also like shirts and things you can buy now that are like right below the video, whatever. Anyway, moving on. So what we're talking about today is a little bit about the future of the Xbox and how that may integrate into the past as far as backwards compatibility. Now, the source of all of this comes from Sarah Bond. She is, I believe, now basically in charge of the Xbox division, or well, I don't know what her exact title is, but she, you know, is super important over at Xbox, like her and Phil Spencer, essentially. And so she had this to say on the Xbox. We have formed a new team dedicated to game preservation, important to all of us at Xbox and the industry itself. Sarah Bond's newly minted president, so Xbox's president. She said in a leaked email to staff that was made public on Monday, at the time I'm recording this. We are building our strong history of delving backwards compatibility to our players, and we remain committed to bringing forward an amazing library of Xbox games for future generations to play and enjoy. And then she also goes on to basically say Microsoft is moving full speed ahead on its next generation hardware, and likely a reference to the fact that the Xbox Series X, you know, there was some rumors that that was going to be the last console, that Microsoft even did like a whole thing about this. I did a video on it already. So a lot of people are taking this story and kind of running with it to say, oh, there's going to be a big backwards compatibility update. Now, for those who don't know, Microsoft surprised a lot of us years ago to try and build up some goodwill. They started making Xbox 360 games backwards compatible with the Xbox One at the time, which then forward over to the Xbox Series X. Everything that was made compatible on from the 360 was naturally compatible as well, save for any Kinect titles, but that was Xbox One specific content. Then they kind of surprised us again by doing an OG Xbox update, the original 2001 era system. They started adding a few games from that system over to the Xbox One and then eventually into the Xbox Series X ecosystem. They eventually stopped this program altogether. I don't remember how many 360 games were added. I think it was a few hundred. And the original Xbox, it was only like 60 titles. I was doing videos on them as they came out. The last update for that was a few years ago, and it was kind of a surprise where they're like, here's a bunch of titles we're going out with, and that's that. Okay. Now, a lot of people are taking this to mean that they intend to do yet another update with a whole bunch of game titles added. That's possible. However, that is not actually my read of this situation. Again, context is key here. So apparently this all comes from an internal Microsoft email that wasn't really meant for the public, although I'm sure they knew it would leak. So keep that one, you know, a grain of salt, I guess. But basically, this sounds like what she was effectively trying to say is our next generation of hardware, whatever that is, we're anticipating bringing over the Xbox Series X ecosystem. So everything that was Xbox Series X specific will be compatible. Everything Xbox One compatible will be, eventually the new Xbox system will be compatible. And any 360 or OG Xbox games that they had produced, they're intending to make compatible. That's my read of it, with the exception being most likely the Kinect titles that were not brought from the Xbox One over to the Series X. I assume they're not going to try and suddenly add them into support. That's really all I think this is her basically saying we've got a team that's going to make sure that all that content that's already compatible is considered and made important into the new ecosystem. Now, we can actually have a discussion about that, because one could argue that that's a good sign for physical media, because most of that content was produced physically. However, and this is not about digital versus physical, but we must consider the reality that they could be like, oh yeah, everything comes over if you have it digitally. If you downloaded it through, whether it was Games with Gold, Game Pass, as temporary as it was, or if you just outright purchased it, and I say purchase in quotations because you can't buy digital content by their own admission, in their EULA, you don't own it. If they're making the case that all that digital stuff is forward carried, that's cool. That's all I would think about this. I don't think this is really proof of anything. However, we're here to speculate, right? Let's have some fun with it. So that's all I think of it. I think this is just an internal memo to say all that content, we want to bring it over, possibly with physical media support, but more likely digital only, would be my guess. But let's entertain the notion that maybe they actually do intend to do yet one more big backwards compatibility update from the 360 and the OG Xbox over to the current ecosystem. Now, I'm less familiar with how many titles were actually supported from the 360 versus how many 360 titles existed. I think they did a few hundred of them versus like the few thousand, including digital ones, that were ever produced. So the percentage of titles is acceptable, not amazing, but fine. Whereas the OG Xbox had about 1,000 titles globally and only like 60 of them were ever added, meaning only 6% of the library is there. So that's ripe for more content. Now, the obvious place to go to would be one of the big things that has happened since they stopped that program was that Microsoft finished their acquisition of Bethesda. Now, granted, I think they maybe they finished owning them by then. I don't really know, because we got a couple like Elder Scrolls games added, but that was about it. There is some additional Bethesda content that hypothetically could be brought over, but the big one is they added Activision. And Activision made a ton of stuff for the Xbox 360 as well as the original Xbox, some of which I think is possible to bring over, and some of which is not. Now, if we're going to ask, like, why can't you just make a blanket emulator that supports everything? It's because of how Microsoft does their backwards compatibility program. What they do, let's assume you're the guy with the physical disc that is for a game that is supported from the 360 or the original Xbox, and you want to use it on the modern ecosystem. When you put that disc in, it doesn't just start playing the disc. What it does is it's actually not even capable of it, apparently, just based on the way they built the system. All it does is have the capability of detecting what the disc even is. And if the title matches the game that is considered supported, it just goes into their server and downloads effectively an emulated build of the game for the system. And because they do it that way, rather than having it run off the disk, they're effectively giving away a new version of it that has new licensing agreements and so on and so forth, especially because they offer the option to buy it digitally. So like if for example, Conquer Live and Reloaded, which was a big Rare-made exclusive original Xbox game, is one of the titles that is supported. If you have the original disc of that and put it into your Xbox Series X, it will detect the disc and just download the build. And as long as the disc stays in the system, even though it doesn't need it other than as an unlock key, it will be able to play the game free of charge. However, if you don't have the original disc, if either you sold it, you don't want it, whatever it is, you can choose to buy the game digitally, again, I use buy in quotations, and pay them a few bucks and get a digital version of it. And effectively, that's a new way of distributing it. So when that's the case, that means there's money to be made. And if there's money to be made, it means that everything has to be on the up and up. So you can't just blanket sell an emulator that says all the games we don't have new licenses for work. You have to have an individual case-by-case basis for every single game that's approved of by not only Microsoft, but whoever the rights holder of that game is. Now, in the case of Conker's Live and Reloaded, it's owned by Microsoft, so they themselves only had to approve it themselves. You see my point? But anything third-party, I think Panzer Dragoon Orta, a game made by Sega, is backwards compatible as well, but it means that Sega had to sign off on it, and it means Sega gets a cut of everything that's sold. Make sense? So with that understanding, the big change that happened, like I said, was the merger of Activision into Microsoft, which means any Activision title that Activision owns outright, Microsoft now owns, and therefore they have control of it. So some of the obvious ones is there's a few Call of Duty games that exist on the original Xbox that hypothetically could be added. But then you start looking at all the other stuff. There's a bunch of Crash Bandicoot games there, which I don't know which ones, if they don't own them all, because this is where it gets confusing, because sometimes a company like Vivendi Universal used to own Crash Bandicoot. No longer do. It's sold off to Activision, and Activision is now owned by Microsoft. Therefore, Crash Bandicoot is owned by Microsoft. But the Vivendi Universal games, they don't own Universal. Do they own those games? Do they own the rights to those specific ones? Or do they just own the ones that Activision specifically made? This is where it starts getting into red tape area. When it gets into red tape area for backwards compatible titles that you don't expect to sell much, it's not worth the red tape. That's why they just don't bother with most cases. So I don't know a full list of everything that would be supported or everything that they would even have considered, but I would say you can pull from the Activision library as the most obvious place to go. And then after that, you can look at who else was very, very supportive of the backwards compatibility program. Sega was very supportive of it. I think like Jet Set Radio Future is still not compatible, although don't quote me on that. I don't remember offhand. I don't think it was, though. And then I know Ubisoft was supportive of it, not like crazy supportive. They were just kind of like, yeah, Splinter Cell is fine. We'll see what else is on there. Disney actually was a huge supporter of it. That's why all the Star Wars games are compatible, with the exception of one, which is ironic. Star Wars Obi-Wan, which was made as an original Xbox exclusive, is not compatible. And I think it's the only one, actually. So they should do that. But then I look at a few other franchises and companies that might be willing to play ball that hadn't previously, and I'll give you one example. I wasn't planning to show like a bunch of titles of like, here's which ones I hope make it. It's more like which ones I think are kind of possible that aren't as super obvious. And the ones I would go with is the company Interplay. I don't know exactly who owns them. I think they are still their own thing at this point. I could be wrong about that. But I do know they made a Fallout game, which is now a property of Bethesda, which is now property of Microsoft. So it wouldn't be totally inconceivable to think that this one might be a possibility to add. And it just kind of, says, hey, more Fallout is available on Xbox. And the other set, which is also Interplay, so you cut one deal, you could cut a bunch, would be for the Baldur's Gate games. Now that Baldur's Gate 3 came out and it was a big deal, it might be kind of cool to be like, hey, we can go back to the originals. I mean, not that there aren't other ways to do this, of course. It's just that for Microsoft, it might look kind of good to just be able to be like, yeah, it's all in one package under the house. But again, there's a bunch of titles. Like I said, the system had about 1,000 games released, and only 60, only 6% were ever made compatible. I'm under no delusion that we would ever get like a full set or anything even close to. I don't even think we would get to 10%. But it'd be nice to add more titles and just see like which ones could be put out there and like which companies are the friendliest with it. But I'm telling you now, if there's any sort of licensing conflict on any particular game, they immediately just cut it off right there, because it becomes too much of a pain. And that can include any number of things, whether or not there was some character in the game that was like a special tie-in for the time, some music in the game that they no longer have access to, an IP changing hands multiple times, whatever it is. Like I said, Crash Bandicoot's kind of a perfect example of that. I think there's Spyro games on there too. Maybe they could do those because they own that. The Call of Duty seems like an obvious one, because Call of Duty not only is still owned by Activision, which is Microsoft. I mean, Microsoft straight up just owns the Call of Duty franchise. There's really nothing conflicting there. They made them to begin with. You see my point? So there were some that like you could look at and be like, oh, Cabela's would be interesting because, like Activision made a ton of those, but Cabela as a company is not owned by them, so they would have to sign off on it. Now, Cabela probably likes free money, so they might do it, but, who knows? There's various examples of that. Like I said, I would want them to see him finish up the Star Wars ones. I know a lot of people were saying, like, why isn't Halo and stuff on there? Which makes sense, but then I think the Master Chief Collection is probably the reason they never bothered with it. But yeah, I'm just trying to sit there and, like, rack my brain on, like, which titles I think would be good. And yeah, I mean, you get it. Like anything hypothetically would be great, but as far as like probability goes, yeah. Oh, some people would want to talk about the Spider-Man games. I think that one's kind of fascinating because for people who don't know or don't remember, back in that time, Activision had the Spider-Man license, which means Activision effectively made a bunch of Spider-Man games that Microsoft owns, so why not throw them up there? I think the problem with that is that the ultimate owner of Spider-Man video game rights is Disney, which also sounds great because Disney's been super cooperative with the backwards compatibility program. And I don't know this to be sure. This is just me throwing this out there. The reason like the new Spider-Man game on PS5 was exclusive over there, it had nothing. I mean, like the development team that did it was a Sony team effectively. But the only reason I think they had permission to use the character was not because they own his movie rights. And everybody's like, oh, they own Sony on Spider-Man. No, they don't. They just own his movie rights, his option. That's it. Disney ultimately owns the character and technically has to sign off on stuff. They're just kind of trapped into a situation with the movies that predates like the late 90s. Like there's about some time that happened. It would not shock me at all if when Sony went to Disney saying, we want to make a Spider-Man game, Disney was told like, we want exclusivity on it on PlayStation. We don't want to go to Xbox or whatever. We just want it on PlayStation. Although I think they're making their way to PC. But if you agree to let us do that, we'll let you use Spider-Man Tom Holland version in some movies at the time, whatever. That's the kind of backdoor deal that kind of happens. So my guess is, and again, it's just a guess, because of that, I would not expect the Spider-Man games to be made compatible, unless for some reason they were also brought over to the PlayStation ecosystem at the exact same time. But that's, again, purely a guess. So I would bet on the safe horse, Call of Duty's a safe horse just because it's a big franchise. It could actually move some units. The games are completely lock, stock, and barrel owned by the same company, etc. So if you want anything that's reaching for the stars, it would be stuff like by Interplay, maybe a few other titles by Sega, whichever. Jet Set Radio Future is actually a very real possibility considering they're doing a new Jet Set Radio game. I don't know if Crazy Taxi 3 was ever added, but if it wasn't, then that's also a good choice. Like I said, I don't have the full thing in front of me, but this is all speculation. Like I said, I don't actually think we're going to get a backwards compatibility update at all out of any of this, but if we do, hey, more the merrier, and if it actually does happen and it gets announced and they have all the titles, I'll talk all about it at that time. 360 I would also be as excited as for as well, because there's a whole bunch of stuff on 360 that they own and made, but yeah, that's it. Who knows what other companies they might be able to get. I'd love to see it if it happens. If nothing else, it's just fun to talk about. Now, which titles I'm very curious that you guys would want to see, and keep it, I mean, you could have the fantasy title, like, oh, wouldn't it be crazy if this totally impossible game like Damon Vector, which is a Taiwanese exclusive original Xbox game, got added. That will never happen, but I'm curious to see what everybody's like fantasy list is versus what they think is a realistic list. You know what I mean? Like, which titles out there do you think actually are probable for X, Y, and Z numbers, or X, Y, and Z reasons? I'm curious. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. As always, if you could please like this video, comment down below, subscribe if you haven't done that before, as well as check out all my social media stuff in the description: Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, Patreon, Spreadshirt, and the Travel Channel. Appreciate the support. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all later.